Today, I want to talk about what the ideal body composition for Hyrox is. And there's a lot of different backgrounds of people coming into Hyrox. The most common that you would think of would be, of course, the runner background or the bodybuilder lifter kind of background. And of course, with those comes very different builds, and all of those have their different pros and cons when it comes to competing in Hyrox. So, for example, if you're leaner and lighter, it's going to be much easier to run and you're going to be able to recover more from the stations while running. And at the same time, a body weight exercise like burpee broad jumps is going to be much easier for you. At the same time, if you're someone who's heavier and has more muscle on you, then, the running portion of the race is going to be a lot harder and you're not going to be able to recover as much from the stations. But at the same time, the stations are probably going to be easier and tax you a little bit less than the running. So if you go too far in either of these directions in terms of really lean and light or really heavy and with a lot of muscle, you're probably going to run into different problems. For example, if you're uh, you know on the heavy side with a ton of muscle and likely more fat as well, then you're not going to be able to run well. You're going to be tired coming into the stations. And then there's a certain point where it just doesn't matter how strong you are if you're absolutely gassed from the running. So you can think about an elite bodybuilder coming into Hyrox. Of course, it's awesome how much muscle they have, but it's probably just not going to go that well because of the running. On the other end, if you can't move the weights well and then you're getting gas from the stations because you're so light and you don't have enough muscle on you, you don't have the mass to move the weights that are required of Hyrox, it doesn't really matter how well you run because you're going to be, again, absolutely smashed from the stations, that your running is going to be taking a pretty big hit. So you can think about, an elite marathoner here, maybe someone who's weighing 140 pounds, uh, coming in and doing Hyrox. Again, it's probably not going to go well. But with all that being said, there is no one single ideal composition. Um, but what I want to help you do today is figure out what is ideal for you when you're competing in Hyrox, which is really all about finding your sort of sweet spot. So in order to do that, the number one thing you've got to start with considering is where's your starting point here. So in terms of that, you want to consider what is your background. Do you come from more of a running or lifting background? And what are your biggest assets in a Hyrox race? Another factor is going to be how tall you are. Um, so if you're looking purely at weight as a number, if you're like 6'5", you're probably going to have a lot more total mass than someone who's 5'5", for example. Um, but just sort of round this out a little bit as a general goal, if you're leaner with more muscle, that is most of the time a good direction to go for Hyrox. Of course, there are limits to this, but that's generally a good path. So on that topic though, can you be too lean? The answer is absolutely yes. It is possible. It's hard to do. It takes a lot of discipline to get to a point where you're too lean to be doing Hyrox. But one of the potential issues that you can run into here, is that you get so lean that you have very low energy levels, which is going to lead to poor training. Uh, and at the same time, if you have low energy levels during the race, that's also going to compromise your race performance. And there's a couple other downsides to being super lean. Uh, Most likely, your hormones are going to be pretty significantly affected and can be out of balance. And finally, and this is related to the previous point, it is very difficult to maintain your muscle when you get really lean. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, having more muscle is generally 2 point beneficial for Hyrox. So, in terms of making the decision of whether or not you should be trying to build muscle, cut fat, or recomp your body, and when I say recomp, the idea there is that you're maintaining your body weight, but building muscle and losing fat at the same time. Again, you want to take in what is your starting spot? Do you have excess fat that you need to lose? Are you severely lacking in muscle? Um, and I will, I'll touch on the recomp point here. It is quite difficult to do that once you're sort of past the beginner phase in your training journey. If you're someone who's more of an intermediate or advanced runner or lifter, it's pretty difficult to do. So we'll look more at this point in terms of building muscle versus cutting fat. You're going to want to consider what is your biggest limiting factor in a Hyrox race. So if it's the running, there's a good chance that you want to be, setting your goal towards burning fat, getting lighter, and that will oftentimes, not always, but generally make it easier for you during the running. If you've gotten to a point where you're really struggling with the stations, there's a good chance that it makes sense to build some muscle, build some strength, build some muscular endurance. That way, the stations will feel easier, and ideally, you're able to do that without compromising your running too much. Okay, so let's say you're now at the point where you have made your decision on either, you are going to cut fat or go on a bit of bulk here. You want to ask yourself, how fast should you be going? And there's a few different factors that should be going into this decision. Number one is, what is your training status? So, have you been lifting for a couple months or weeks, or have you been lifting for 15 years? And then you want to also ask yourself, how far do you have to go to get to your goal? For example, if you've decided you need to cut down 50 pounds versus if you need to cut down 5, you're probably going to have to go a lot faster. And you probably have more of a margin for error if you're going from 50 pounds versus if you're just trying to cut 5. It can be a pretty slow, gradual process. So finally, you're going to want to consider, if you're cutting or bulking. Generally, I would recommend that cutting happen a little bit faster and bulking happen a little bit slower. So as a couple general ranges here, I would recommend for cutting anywhere from, I used to say 1 to 2 pounds per week. I will update this to, in my belief, you can be in a very good spot anywhere from 0.5 pounds per week of weight loss to 2 pounds per week, in my experience, has worked well. And on the bulking side, again, as I mentioned, much slower. I would typically go anywhere from, I've been considering going as low as 0.2 pounds per week to about a half pound per week. And just to give you an idea of what some of these numbers look like over a longer time scale. So on the upper end of the cut, if you're going 2 pounds a week, you're looking at 8 to 10 pounds a month, which is pretty significant. If you do that, let's say over 6 months, you go with the full 10 pounds, 60 pounds is a lot of weight to shred off in the span of 6 months. On the other end, it can be much lower. If you're going with a half pound a week, you're looking at more like about 2 pounds a month. But again, even that, over 6 months, which is a reasonably long time scale, right? Uh, you're still looking at 12 pounds, a little over 12 pounds of weight loss, which is definitely enough to move the needle there. And to draw a bit of a picture for you on the bulking side, um, if you go with a half pound a week, again, pretty similar to uh, the half pound cut, about 2 pounds a month, um, versus if you're going with zero point 0.2 pounds a month on the lower, excuse me, zero point 0.2 pounds per week on the lower end, you're looking at closer to 1 pound of body weight gain per month. Uh, and again, it's hard to build muscle, so there's nothing wrong with going quite slow there. Um, one of the well, there's a couple reasons for that on either end. So if you are cutting too fast, you're probably going to be sacrificing a good amount of muscle. Um, and at the same time, your energy levels will probably be quite low. You'll generally be feeling quite hungry, like around the clock, which is not fun. It's going to be harder to sustain. So when you get to the end of that cut, you want to be considering like, is this a new body weight that I can actually maintain, or are you going to be tired of being starved for a couple weeks or months and just want to eat everything back? On the other end, with the bulking, if you go too fast, there's generally pretty good research that shows past a certain point, you're not going to build much additional muscle. It'll just be extra fat, which is certainly not ideal for Hyrox in most cases. And at the same time, you'll probably just in general feel pretty sluggish if you're always, filled to the brim with food, and you've got a whole bunch of extra weight that you're not used to carrying, especially during the running portion of your training. So I want to talk about uh, some of my experiences with both cutting and bulking, and how I've kind of learned about that over time. So I'll start off by diving through a few of the cuts that I've done. The very first one I ever did, I didn't really set a goal much at all, other than I wanted to get leaner. This was very early in my lifting days. I didn't really track anything. I weighed myself maybe once a week or so, which is fine. You don't have to weigh yourself more than that. And I did lose weight. I probably cut down somewhere around 10 pounds or so. But then, sort of when I got to that point, um, I basically just went back to my old diet, and I think I probably put the 10 pounds back on. Not that long of a time scale. And, that was okay. I definitely learned from it. And if you fast forward a couple of years later, I was actually doing 75 hard at the time when I started doing this, and I shot for a weight loss of 2 pounds a week, which it certainly depends on your starting point, but for a lot of people, I wouldn't recommend this. This was not fun, especially the deeper I got into this cut. My energy levels were pretty brutal. Strength levels were way down. This was during the pandemic, so I was outside doing a lot of cardio, biking specifically. And, I think I also pushed this one too far. I think I went down from, probably 175 or 180 down to about 155 pounds, that was super light for me. I was really lean, which was cool, but I felt awful. I was hungry all the time. Wouldn't recommend that. I will say that what I was doing here is I would track my weight daily, so I would weigh myself very first thing in the morning after going to the washroom, uh, and that was able to help me get it much more dialed in and make sure I was making consistent progress. And coming out of that, I ended up, intentionally starting to bulk, but uh, I think around the end, I wasn't really able to maintain that 2 pounds per week, and I was so hungry at the end of it that the bulk ended up happening much faster than I had originally planned. Um, Beyond that, more kind of as I had started training for Hyrox, uh, I started doing my cuts at 1 pound a week. So at, you know, twice as slow as what I was doing before. And that generally worked much better, felt much more sustainable, felt less hungry overall. I didn't cut down as far. I think the lowest I ever got during those 1 pound per week cuts was around 165. Um, and you know, there were some issues. Of course, I lost strength, and that was, it was still a pretty big cut. I think I went from you know, just under 200, 195-ish, down to 165. So a good 30 pounds there. And again, consistently weigh myself every day, first thing in the morning, definitely made it easier to stay on track there. And I'll add that for all of these, I've never counted calories. You know, I'll get a pretty good idea of how much I'm eating on a daily basis, but not necessarily tracking calories. Uh, Finally, where I'm at right now is I've been cutting at a half pound per week, and this is probably the best results I've ever gotten cutting. I'm getting a little bit leaner. I'm getting faster with my running. I generally don't feel hungry all the time. I feel like my energy levels are great. Uh, and again, it's just much easier to stay consistent at this rate. I know I rambled on for quite a bit there about my cutting experiences, so I'll try and make the bulking pretty quick here. Almost always what I've been doing for bulking is 0.4 pounds per week, which adds up to about 2 pounds per month. Um, I find for me that's a pretty good spot to be. Of course, gain a tiny bit of fat when doing that, but not too much. Energy levels are great, of course. I'm getting stronger. Uh, and generally, that's at a point where, I'm not feeling bloated all the time or, like I can't run well. But I think in the future, I am going to experiment with, again, cutting that rate in half like I did for some of my cuts. So I'll be trying for 0.2 pounds a week, which I know seems really slow, but the goal is to preserve muscle, or excuse me, reduce the amount of fat that I'm adding on to as absolutely minimal as possible while just getting a nice lean bulk in and adding some muscle. So I'll be experimenting with that. We'll see how it goes. Um, I'd like to round this out with a few final tips related to changing body composition for Hyrox. So number one, I would not recommend being in a calorie deficit going into Hyrox. I have been there. It doesn't work well. Your uh, energy levels on race day are not going to be great, and that will affect your performance. So what I would recommend is if you are cutting, probably stop at least a month before your race. Let your body adjust to your new maintenance calories. Make sure your energy levels are great going into the race, and you should be in a good spot. Final tip is that just like your training, whether it's lifting or running, there are two keys here, and that is consistency and sustainability in terms of your diet, your weight loss. Uh, Absolutely key. We're in this for for the long term, that is how we make it work. Finally, if you are looking for help with your Hyrox training, you can check out my app, Hybrid Strength Fitness. It'll get you set up with a custom built training program for you to get you set for your best performance in your next Hyrox race. And the link for that is in the description.